Send out a quick note later today. Today's February 29th. For those of you who are into Young Israel of Orange County miscellanea, we were founded February 29th, 2008. That was our first Shabbos, February 29th, 2008. So what that means is, depending on how you look at things, this is either our 16th anniversary or our 4th anniversary. If you've ever seen Pirates of Penzance, you know that reference also. So we have to normally wait. In fact, my first time, it's a long story, but one of the factors, first time I ever went out on a date with Rebbetzin Ellen Zichron Levracha. As it turns out, we both knew right away after our first phone call that this was going to be the one. And so I wasn't going to blow it on a cup of coffee. I was going to take Ellen to a proper dinner. And it's the only time in the history of Pat's Restaurant that they even had somebody making reservations and saying, I want a vase of roses waiting for her on the table. And they didn't know how to do that. And I had to explain to them where to buy the roses and where to get the vase. And otherwise I have to bring my own vase. But I wanted her to get there before me. I don't want to see the guy comes, puts a vase, takes a rose and goes out. So anyway, part of the calculus was, do we go out on February 29th? It happened to be, I think, year 2000. I decided this one's the one. And our first date is not going to be February 29th because we're going to celebrate every year the anniversary of our first date. And I'm not going to start every year with the shtick that is it February 28th or is it March 1st. So it's a long story. But today is February 29th, our 4th anniversary or our 16th. And we've had to reinvent ourselves over the course of time for various reasons. And God has blessed us with continued success in reinventing and taking advantage of new technologies. Let's learn. Again, thank you for being here. Let me put on the sound. And I may optimize later for the video clip. The challenge is, for those of you that use Zoom, there are two little squares when you first share. One is to share sound, one is to optimize video. And when I share, you'll always hear my voice okay. But to get good sound out of the YouTube clips, you need to click share sound. But you still end up with that slow, sloggy video. If you click optimize video, so why not do it? Then you've got everything and it's nice and clear. But then it creates those little squares, those 6 or 8 little squares around the screen. So then the obvious perfect idea is share sound. Don't optimize video, except when you show the video. But what invariably happens is by the time I'm into the class, I'm well into the class and I get to the video, I forget to optimize. So anyway, here we go. Let's just do a few quick. Okay, get that out of the way and get that out of the way. Here we go. Okay, take this off the screen. All right. We begin. We're now past all the laying of the foundations and the foundations and groundwork. Some of this may sound like we did this a while ago because we've done so much in between laying foundations and groundwork. But now we're moving forward. Here we go. We're in chapter 5 of Hilkhot Melachim. We've established the extraordinary power of the king in those times. And again, one of the reasons I've spent so much time on this is the following. I don't know that I exactly spelled it out, so this is a chance to do it now. In order to study Jewish law, there's the theory of law and the practice of law. It's one thing to learn any subject, it's another thing to practice it. And a lot of things look very simple on paper, but it's a little bit different when you're out in the field. So we can learn books of Jewish law, which we're going to be doing, which we are doing, but on let's say the law of war. But when did we actually have practice? Think about it. In 3,300 years of Jewish history, when did Jews actually find ourselves in a position to implement or apply Jewish law in terms of war and ethics. Think about it. Abraham going to war to save Lot. Yitzchak didn't really go to war. Yaakov prepared for war, never went to war. Moshe, there were slaves in Egypt. God was fighting the war with the 10 plagues. After the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, we had a few wars in the desert. Amalek, Og Melech Habashan, Sichon Melech Amori. There were a few wars, Nikom Nikmat Midyan. There were a few wars. The main wars took place at the times of the biblical judges, Sefer Shoftim, and think of Samson, think of Gideon, think of Devorah, and she went with Barak, and then Malachim, Shmuel, books of Samuel. You've got King Saul, King David, and then Malachim, the other kings. And that's when Jews went to war and applied, or did not properly apply, let's say, laws of war. Once the Bible closes with the book of Esther, because the Maccabees are post-biblical, Esther is the last historical event really in the Bible, in the Tanakh. And that was quite a massacre, okay? And I'm not saying it with an apology. The Bible tells us it was a good massacre, and that's part of what we're learning. It was a highly praised massacre by the Jews of the anti-Semites of Persia. That's chapter 9 of the book of Esther. We're a month away from Purim. What's chapter 9? That Achashverosh had given authority through Haman to the anti-Semites to kill the Jews on a day designated, and then it all turned up nahafochu, and it all turned upside down. The day that they were supposed to kill us, we were given authority to kill them. And Jews did not go in Persia saying, well, we're very grateful, thanks. It's very rewarding and reassuring, but no, we're not going to do that. We did that. We massacred them. We massacred all the anti-Semites of Persia. And by the way, that wasn't enough. So the day's over, and we've massacred all the anti-Semites, and King Ahasuerus says to Esther, you happy now? Not sarcastically, but I love you as my wife. I gave you the okay. We good? Everything nice? And what'd she do? She came and said, we'd like another day to kill more. And he said, okay, have another day to kill more. And that's what Shushan Purim is about. So apparently massacring, it's not the way you talk in the West. It's not the Geneva Conventions. By the way, the Geneva Conventions apply only to Israel. No other country. What country? The International Court of Justice. You remember the trial of Vladimir Putin for what he did in Ukraine? I don't. Come on. What's going on in the Congo? What's going on with Somalia and Ethiopia? Give me a break. Nobody puts anybody on trial. All these different Arab countries that massacre their own people, nobody puts them on trial. The Geneva Accords apply only to Jews. It's a fascinating thing. Just like everything else, all these moralities of Western society, they only apply to Jews. And we see what's going on in the world today, all the demonstrations, people demonstrating against Israel. Do you know, I mean, it's always not really the best to get involved in whataboutism. Like, that's not the best answer to say, well, I did something bad. Well, what about this guy? No, I mean, you have to be able to say what you're doing is right. Nevertheless, what about? What about, you don't see any men. Columbia University, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, Penn, Columbia, well, I said that already, Berkeley, UCLA. Nobody's got resolutions, and you don't have professors ranting and raving against any other massacre going on. No one's angry at Putin. Everybody's walking around with Nike shoes. They boycott the hummus. They boycott Sabra hummus that's made in Astoria, Queens. But because it's called Sabra. But nobody's boycotting Nike or other Chinese products, Chinese-made goods. Companies are not walking out of China because of what they're doing to the Uyghurs, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I don't want to waste all of your time with this. But in bringing this point out, so I'm saying that massacring can be okay. And of course, it's one of the real wonderful things about having retired from teaching law school. And many people for many years were asking me to post on YouTube. And this was always in the back of my mind. I'll post a thing like this, and some student in the law school will take that post, clip off everything, and just have a quick 15-second TikTok. Professor Fischer saying massacring the non-Jews is good. And then it's all around the school, and then everybody's got it out of context, and you run into the movie Tar, where they take that little piece out of context, and next thing you know, cancel culture, yada, yada. It's a machaya to be able to, it's a pleasure to be able to just teach Torah. And we're talking about Jewish values of war. Massacring in certain cases is okay and good, according to the book of Esther, chapter 9. And anyone who wants to say that, Rabbi, you're really a little bit overstating it now, then I would say to that person, then you interpret chapter 9 to me. Go and look it up in all the commentary, find any commentary you like, find any way to read that text, how that's not a good thing, to the degree that Esther and Mordechai asked for an additional day to keep killing him. So we see that killing is not, on the one hand, a happy thing, and it's an unfortunate thing, but not only is it not something to apologize for, but according to Jewish ethics, under certain circumstances, it's the right thing to do. Now, let's be very clear about another thing. As I keep teaching you about Jewish ethics of war and values and the time of the judges, there are a lot of things in the Torah we don't do today, okay? Not only because there is no Beit HaMikdash, and therefore we don't have the temple, we don't have Beit HaMikdash, we don't have korbanot, sacrifices. There are certain things that are in the Torah that don't apply today, or that for which you need a Sanhedrin. A proper Sanhedrin, not an American court or an Israeli court, which is all political and not made up of Torah scholars, and it's not based on Torah law. And you need a Torah court of Sanhedrin, the kind of rabbis that we were learning about 2 weeks ago with the story of King Yanai, the kind of Gedolei Yisrael, the Torah giants who are the major rabbinic authorities of the Talmud, for example. Those are the people. They weren't just rabbis. Today you've got rabbis and you have judges. You have judges in the Israeli courts. You have rabbis at shuls. I don't know. In those times, the rabbis were the judges also. In the Torah times, the Kohen Gadol and the Kohanim, the Kohens were the judges. And so in a situation where the Torah is being applied, well, then you have other things. So, for example, Torah speaks about stoning someone who breaks Shabbos. Does that mean we go around now stoning people who break Shabbos? Of course not. Of course not. There are so many layers in understanding that, for which we would need 3 months background just to get into that stuff. But first of all, you have a different culture when you have a Beit HaMikdash. When you have a Beit HaMikdash, people are keeping Shabbat, not because they're afraid they're going to get stoned, but because it's a whole different culture. The whole society is different. Open the Gemara. There's no fascination. You don't have a Taylor Swift, Kelsey football player fascination where Rabbi Yochanan talks to Rabbi Akiva and says, how do you like Taylor Swift? And the other one says, I understand she was chugging alcohol. Who cares? It's a whole different culture. They're talking Torah. I mean, they're really, when you sit and learn Gemara for 5-10 years, not to mention a lifetime, you realize it's a whole different world. Brangelina, who cares? I could start naming all of these celebrities that consume so much of American. I'm a baseball fan, Yankee fan. So there was A-Rod with J-Lo. I mean, there was Jennifer Aniston also with Brad before he became Brangelina. And then Jennifer Aniston, I think, with someone else. And Britney Spears always shows up in these things. Judaism, when you have a Beit HaMikdash, people are talking all day long about Shabbos. On Wednesday, it's only 3 more days to Shabbos. So you don't have people breaking Shabbos the same way. Of course, in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, there were no cars. That's another story. But even if there would have been, it's a different mindset. It's that you love the Torah and the mitzvot because you love the Torah and the mitzvot. That's the society in which you happen to circulate. It's kind of like the difference, honestly, as someone who has lived in Brooklyn, in heavily Orthodox communities, who lived for 2 years in Israel, in an Orthodox community, usually a modern Orthodox communities where I found myself, versus living in Orange County, which is not the same. Everything is different. It feels different. Orange County, there's one outdoor eatery for kosher. And thank God there's that, because there wasn't when we started our shul and before than when I came here 20 years ago. So thank God for that. Now there's a mikveh. Now there's an eruv. All these things that, thank God, I was empowered by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to bring to Orange County. And then Rabbi Eliezer brought a mikveh to Yor Belinda. That did not exist 20 years ago. And lots of stuff. But it's not the same like growing up in Brooklyn. And that's not the same like growing up in Mea She'arim or when you're living in a Torah environment, think in the back of your mind. I'm sure many of you, not everybody, has seen the movie Ushpizin, that Sukkot seasonal movie out of Israel, which shocked a lot of people. It's the first time they ever made a movie in Israel that was not anti-religious. And people, I remember getting the calls and emails. I think it was made in Israel. It's in Hebrew, but it's too pro-religion to have come out of Israel. And I remember you've all seen it. Many of you have seen it. If you live in a community like that, do you remember scenes where every single home has a sukkah? And there's like 2 or 3 levels of homes. They're like a 3-floor condo apartment type structure. And everybody's got sukkahs on their balconies. Everybody's got a sukkah. And then there's one dishonest guy, and he steals another guy's sukkah. Who does that in Orange County? Halavai, that would be wonderful. There should be Jews worried about stealing sukkahs. Do you know what that would be? That Jews actually would have such a Jewish consciousness. It's sukkahs. I don't have a sukkah. No one's watching. This guy has a lot of money. He could buy himself another sukkah. Let me steal it now. Nobody's watching. Okay? And that way, like, a sukkah is born every minute. So you have that in the old world, in a yeshiva world. So I need you to please understand, when we talk about massacring people, it's like talking about stoning people on Shabbos. It depends on the culture. It depends on the world. Is there an active Beis HaMikdash? Is there an active Sanhedrin? Are people all over the place having sukkahs and are people all over the place walking up and down the street with a lulav and etrog and so on and so forth? And in that world, everything is different. Everything's different. Not to mention, no one gets punished for breaking a Torah law without first getting a formal warning by someone who's witnessing the person in the act. And there's a lot of stuff. So that has to be set in place. The only times we had the authority and the power to actually do this stuff was Sefer Shoftim, Sefer Shmuel, Sefer Melachim, the 2 Shmuels, 2 Melachim. By the time of the Gemara, we start losing our authority. We still had some military authority. The Gemara briefly talks about the Maccabees in Mesekhet Shabbat. The Gemara talks about Bar Kokhba, a little bit here and there. It's not a lot of stuff, but a certain amount of sugyas that talk about the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the tragedies, the Romans wiping them out. You really don't find any reference at all to Masada in the Gemara. That just doesn't exist in the Gemara. And then halfway through the Gemara period, in fact, actually before the Gemara period, Mishneh came first. With the fall of Bar Kokhba, time of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is a Tana in the Mishneh. So that tells you right there, Jewish independence and Jewish fighting and Jewish war, it ended with the Mishneh. There's no fighting in the Gemara. So, and then for the next 2,000 years, Jews don't have the authority. What are we going to do? When are we going to fight? And then now we live in the time of the state of Israel. It's the first time in 2,000 years Jews have the ability to fight. And so all of these issues that we're talking about, both as background and in the text, we're challenged. How do we apply it to the modern period? So if I were to tell you, for example, read you some Pesukim out of the Torah, that someone who breaks Shabbos gets stoned, and then let's say I were to say to you that for 3,000 years, Jews had no authority to implement that, and now there's a state of Israel, so do we implement? Of course we don't. We don't do that. And by the way, our Christian neighbors and friends, there are certain things in the Christian Bible, and there's kind of an understanding in the Christian world that certain things are no longer done. What the future will hold, I hope we never see a return to the Catholic Inquisition that took place under Spain and Portugal in the 1400s. I hope we never see a return. That's what happened under Pope Urban II in 1096 that kicked off 200, 300 years of crusades. And what happened to the Jews in Germany and France and up and down the Seine River and the and in places like Mainz and all those places, Speyer and all those cities in France and in Germany and England also. May that never happen again. Today's Christians, there are so many Catholics, Protestants, pro-Israel, yada, yada, yada. We won't spend a lot of time on it. But this is important to understand. That's part of the challenge with our friends, our cousins, so to speak, the Muslims, because it does not always seem that the same percentage of Muslims perceive their Quran, draw the line where what the Quran said in the year 1,000 years ago, like, does that still apply today? Are Jews still apes and monkeys? And is it still a mitzvah to kill Jews? So you'd like to think that like we're past that, which we obviously are not. And so you have to be very discerning which Arab Muslim you're talking about, which imam, and you don't want to paint everybody with one brush. On the other hand, you don't want to put yourself in a position where you maybe have people working in your house as your caregivers and maids and servants, and then on October 7th, they know the layout of your house. So it's very complicated. So we're going to see, I mean, it's strong stuff, but this is where we start from, and then we see where it goes. So we left off and we continue from chapter 5 of Malachim, of Hilkhot Malachim. Some of this we did already, and now we have the context and background. There are two kinds of war, a Milchemet Mitzvah and a Milchemet R'shut, a mandated war and an optional war. A mandated war is a war a Jew must fight. Does that mean every Jew, a Jew in Bosnia? No, the Jews living under a Jewish commonwealth, a Jewish sovereignty. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a Jew in Bosnia has to be part of the war. But the people of Israel in biblical times, and remember, Rambam is codifying his Mishnah Torah in the late 1000s, 1100s. So this is long, long after the Jews have been exiled from Israel by the Romans, about 1,000 years into the exile. So he's really talking about now. He's saying, here's the laws, such as they existed, but I'm not preparing for you a code of Jewish law for it. This is not a history book. This is a book for how to live Jewish law. And this is the law. Now, when is this law going to come into effect? He had no way to know, maybe, that actually 1,000 years from now, you're writing it in 1100, in 1030, 1040. Guess what? In 2024, it's going to be very, very pertinent. And it's the first time since the codification that comes into play. But it still applies. There are mitzvah wars and optional wars. And a mitzvah war must be fought. It's not optional. That's why there's optional wars. So you can understand there's two different. So what's a mitzvah? Ezo hi Milchemet Mitzvah. And which is a commanded war? Now, of course, again, Israel is not an halakhic country. It's not an anti-halakhic country. It facilitates the living of a halakhic life. But Israel's not a halakhic country. It has never had a prime minister who's Orthodox, except a few months of Naftali Bennett. And he certainly could not possibly have governed like as an Orthodox person per se. He was Orthodox, maintained his public orthodoxy, honored. He's Orthodox, he's honest. But he was not imposing an Orthodox country. And so let's understand, I mean, you've got a situation where if there's a mitzvah, you have to go to war, but the country's not being run by a Sanhedrin. So it's challenging. How do you apply the law? As with so many other laws, if the country is Jewish, but not halakhic, but not anti-halakhic, but well, it's a mess. And that's why rabbis study this. and teach it and analyze it. But there's a mandatory war. Number one, Ezo hi Milchemet Mitzvah. Just a reminder, Milchemet Sheva Amamim u'Milchemet Amalek. The war against the 7 nations and the war against Amalek. What 7 nations? What Amalek? Deuteronomy 20, Devarim chapter 20. What does it say? We'll skip some of it. We'll go back to it again another time, but not for tonight. Tonight is the part where we're told there are certain countries we have to go to war against. Rak me arei ha'amim ha'ela asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha nachala lo techayeh kol neshama. These particularly designated nations that are about to be designated are to be wiped out, eradicated. These are the nations that God, your Lord God, is giving you an inheritance. They have been keeping the furniture warm for you so that you don't go into an empty land. And they have been able to enjoy that land, the chosen land, the promised land, while sinning greatly to the point that they finally aggregated so many sins over so many centuries that by virtue not of Israel coming in, but by virtue of their sins, it now is time for them to go. I am not driving out the 7 nations and bringing you to drive them out simply to make room for you. I am declaring, says God, those nations now, it is their time to be expelled, regardless of the Jews coming in. Their sins have multiplied to the point that the Holy Land no longer can absorb or tolerate it. Lo techayeh kol neshama. You shall not allow a single soul of them to remain alive. Ki hacharem tacharimem. You are utterly, for those of you that know Hebrew, it could simply have said ki tacharimem. It adds the word hacharem tacharimem to emphasize, reinforce the word utterly. You shall utterly eradicate the Hittite and the Amorite, the Canaanite and the Perizzite, Chiti Amori, Kanani Perizzi, Chivi Yavusi, the Hivite and the Jebusite, that's 6, and the Girgashite, who is not listed. It's another discussion why they're not listed, but they're included. Ka'asher tzivcha, from the word mitzvah, or mitzvah from the word tzivui. This is what God commands you. Leman asher lo yalamdu etchem la'asot kechol to'avotam. Now you're leaving Egypt, coming into the land of Israel, and you are to be a holy people in the Holy Land, and they must not remain there where they will pollute you and corrupt your values. Interestingly, it's not like the modern concern, well, if you leave the Arab Muslims in Israel, I mean, they represent a security threat. The Torah does not say these 7 nations represent a security threat. Torah says they represent a spiritual threat that will destroy the Jewish people, even more horribly than would the security threat, because it destroys the nation and the whole purpose of the nation. Asher asu le'Elohehem. All the to'avot, all the detestable things they have done in worshiping their gods, v'chatatem la'Hashem Elokechem. It will be your sin before God, chet, sin, if you don't destroy them. You have to destroy them. And then, chapter 25, particularly, and over and above those 7, you must wipe out Amalek. Zachorit asher salech Amalek. Remember particularly what Amalek did to you, b'derech b'tzeichem Mitzrayim, as you just were getting out of Egypt after the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, Kriyat Yamsuf. They attacked you from behind, the first nation that dared attack the people who were coming out safely from Egypt by God's miracles of the 10 plagues. Asher korcha b'derech v'yezaneh b'cha kol hanecha shalim acharecha. They encountered you on the path after the Sea of Reeds split in the desert. A zanav is a tail. They came at you from the back. You were marching forward with your banners and your flags and your formations of your tribes, and the men and the armed and the strong up front, and behind are the younger people and the wives and the children, and they attack from behind, which is not done, not even in biblical times. You don't attack from behind. Asher kocha baderech v'yazaneh b'cha kol hanecha shalim acharecha v'ata ayef v'yageh v'lo yareh Elokim. It was a time that you were exhausted. You had just been through hundreds of years of Egyptian slavery, had your heart speeding out of your chest as you stood at the Sea of Reeds, unsure what would happen with the Egyptians coming down on you, never imagining the sea would split. You hastened through the sea. You made it to the other side. You didn't even have time to unwind, and already they attacked. Therefore, when God grants you safety from all your enemies around you in the land your God is giving you as an hereditary portion, noten lecha nachala l'rishta, it's your inheritance of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. When, as we just saw 5 chapters ago, you drive out the other nations, timche et zecha Amalek mitachar hashamayim, wipe out the memory of Amalek. Don't forget. After October 7, Prime Minister Netanyahu held a press conference, or actually made not a press conference, he delivered a speech to the nation. And it was 4 months ago, October 8th, the day after the October 7 Shabbat Shmini Atzeret Hamas massacre of 1,200 Israelis and people from Cambodia and Thailand who were there helping families and well, you know the story. Netanyahu wanted to rally the troops and reassure his nation, very similarly to the way George W. Bush made a famous speech after 9/11. The nation's in shock, and they need their head of government to address them and reassure them that all is well or going to be well, that we've got a plan. Let me remember to optimize the sound for this, and then I have to remember to de-optimize. Just let me try to do this the right way. Okay, we're going to optimize for a few seconds. Optimize. You may get some black squares, and we'll see what happens. Here we go. Get that off the screen. Okay. Get some sound.
Non capisco perché non abbiate il fegato di condannare questi eccidi come non capisco perché non abbiate il fegato di condannare questi eccidi come io ovviamente ho condannato immediatamente.
All right.
You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible, and we do remember, and we are fighting. Our brave troops and combatants who are remember what Amalek has done to you, says.
You're talking to the nation that is in shock as they're waking up to the
remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible, and we do remember, and we are fighting. Our brave troops and combatants who are now in Gaza or around Gaza and in all other regions in Israel are joining.
Listen one more time. Is he calling for a massacre and utter genocide of Arab people, of Gazans, or is he talking figuratively, drawing on the national culture, including to a country that is 50% secular? Well, not really. It's more like 20% hardcore secular, 40% Orthodox, 30% strongly traditional. And everybody knows about Amalek in that world. Is he inspiring them that these horrible people that have done this evokes memories of what Amalek did? Is he saying we should massacre? Well,
remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible, and we do remember, and we are fighting. Our brave troops.
In other words, he cites Amalek for one purpose, to highlight we remember. We will remember October, just like it's a Jewish biblical cultural way of saying what Franklin Roosevelt said after Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, a day that shall live in infamy. In other words, Roosevelt was saying 82 years ago, we will never forget this day. Of course, I can tell you firsthand as a professor of law students, it's long been forgotten, except for Tom Cruise movies. Nevertheless, what he is doing, he's invoking, as Roosevelt did on December 7th, we will never forget.
To remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible, and we do remember, and we are fighting our brave troops and combatants who are now in Gaza or around Gaza and in all other regions in Israel are joining this chain of Jewish heroes, a chain that has started 3,000 years ago from Joshua ben Nun until the heroes of 1948, the Six-Day War, the 73 October War, and all other wars in this country. Our hero troops, they have one supreme main goal: to completely defeat the murderous enemy and to guarantee our existence in this country. We've always said, never again. Never again is now.
Okay. Now the media get involved. Here's social media. Yay for TikTok. A world of lies that we live in. Osama Abu Daher. And the next thing you know, you've got the International Court of Justice. What about the International Court of Justice? Here we go. Come on. All right, let's see if I can just bounce it in. Okay, let me bring it up this way. Here we go. Okay, let's just bring it up this way. I guess I just knocked it out. There we go. Okay.
Prime Minister Netanyahu, in his address to the Israeli forces on 28 October 2023, preparing for the invasion of Gaza, urged the soldiers to remember what Amalek has done to you. This refers to the biblical command by God to Saul for the retaliatory destruction of an entire group of people known as the Amalekites, put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. The genocidal invocation to Amalek was anything but idle. It was repeated by Mr. Netanyahu in a letter to the Israeli Armed Forces on 3 November 2023. Madam President, let the Prime Minister's words speak for themselves.
זכור את אשר עשה לך עמלק, נצטווינו. אנו זוכרים ואנו נלחמים.
Okay. So we have now so far.
Apparently, 61% of Germans do not.
Right?
You may have noticed.
Just don't worry.
on the
Just
list
take
of
a moment.
speakers
Get this out.
that I appear as Abraham.
Okay, let's just get that. Oh,
Abraham is my real name.
here we go. Okay, good. So we've devoted some time to seeing the text itself, talking about the text, and understanding the context of the text. Let's continue learning now. Back to Rambam. So the king, Milchemet Mitzvah. A king engages in a commanded war. The Ezohi Milchemet Mitzvah, so Milchemet Shivat Amamim. We just saw in Deuteronomy 20, the 7 nations. Milchemet Amalek. Be'ezrat Yisrael miyad sor shaba alehem. And the third kind of mitzvah war, commanded war, is to go to war against a people who attack Israel. A war fought to assist Israel from an enemy that attacks them. Ezrat Yisrael, to help Israel, miyad sar, from an oppressor, shaba alehem, who attacks them. Nowadays, who is Amalek? We have absolutely no idea. Anyone who tells you Hamas is Amalek, or Russia is Amalek, or China is Amalek, they have no idea what they're talking about. It is a figurative term nowadays because Amalek is actually a genetic matter. Are you or aren't you from that people? Likewise, those 7 nations. Who today is from the Hivites, or the Perizzites, or the Girgashi, or the Kanani, even 23andMe, or any of these DNA kind of programs. I've had people, hey, I'm a rabbi, so I get people all the time saying, not all the time, but I get people quite often saying to me, Rabbi, I have to tell you, I just found out I'm Jewish, or I'm 30% Jewish. I have a wonderful, wonderful friend of mine who is one of my dearest life friends, going back to when I practiced law at Jones Day in 1994. So we're talking 30 years ago. He's an American from German descent, and he's married to an American lady of German descent. And I had certain preconceived notions about people of German descent, I must say. And part of my life perspective changed greatly as I got to meet this extraordinary man who has been one of my dearest friends for the last 30 years. Now lives in Missouri. And in fact, he was just traveling out in California, made it his business, having learned about my lung illness at the time, to stop by and visit. Can you imagine that? He only had limited time. He couldn't even meet with some other people, but he made time to go all the way out to Orange County just to me. And on top of that, he asked me, where can he buy kosher food for me? And he stopped off at Kosher Nosh, and he brought some pastrami sandwiches so that he could have a kosher pastrami thing with his wife. And so this gentleman, I speak to him once every 2-3 months. We stay in touch. And we were just talking. He said, you're never going to believe what I just found out. What'd you find out? I just got back the results of 23andMe, and it turns out I've got 50% of my DNA is Jewish. Can you believe it? And I didn't know whether I should say, actually, in your case, yeah, I really can. But I didn't know if that would be considered a compliment or if he really wants to be considered not, I don't know what people do. So I said, well, who knows? So he asked me, I got into the whole thing on the phone. What exactly is a Jew? What does this mean? I told him, first you have to start complaining more. You have to start kvetching. Learn about the kvetch. You can't be like a German anymore, okay? Does your back hurt? He says, well, I can put up with it. No, that's that 50% that isn't Jewish. The other 50% is you got to learn the word oy. That's the only Hebrew word you need to know. It's not even Hebrew, but it'll get you through 90% of your Jewish life. Oy. How are your kids doing? Oy. How are you doing financially? Oy. Did you hear what happened to Trump? Oy. How about Biden? Oy. All of America. Oy. Israel. Oy. Ukraine. Oy. The stock market. Oy. But it went up 500 points. Oy. It'll work. It'll go down. So anyway, that's how it is. Amalek and those 7 nations don't exist anymore. We don't know who they are. And you don't find them in 23andMe. So we need to understand when they're talking, Netanyahu talking here and the ICJ there, it doesn't apply anymore. The only thing that still applies, and it very much applies to this war with Hamas, is it's a case of the enemy coming to attack and persecute the Jews and killing Jews. And it's not theoretical. It's not just some anti-Semite Houthi, let's say, Houthi in Yemen, but what happened October 7, Shabbat Shmini Atzeret, was an actual, you know what it was. Therefore, that makes it a Milchemet Mitzvah. What we're learning now, an actual halacha, is that Israel, according to Jewish law, has to go to war because they've been attacked. If they would not go to war, I mean, if there were a Sanhedrin, it practically would be forced to go to war. But there's no Sanhedrin, so you can't really superimpose or impose halakha on the government. But to the degree that the government is a war, it is a mitzvah war, which is different from an optional war. Different rules apply in an optional war. Okay. Now, what about optional wars? They only come into play after all the mitzvah wars are finished. Achar kach nilcham b'Milchemet R'shut. After the mitzvah wars, the commanded wars are done, then optional wars may be started. That's the kind of war that's fought with other nations, other than the designated 7 plus Amalek, solely for the purpose of imperialism, to expand the nation's borders, to make its reputation greater and more famous, sort of more classical imperialism. And obviously that doesn't look, we're all Zionists here. We know what we think and what we hope and none of us cares for imperialism. None of us is even in the back of our minds would imagine we'd like a bigger country that expands into, I don't know, Iraq and Jordan. If God wants to send Mashiach and he wants to create borders like that, that's not for us to deal with. The last thing we need is to have the people of Jordan and Iraq under Israel's control. No more than that has to be said. Okay. Milchemet Mitzvah einot tzarich litol R'shut Beitin. For a commanded war, there's no need to go to court for an approval, or the American equivalent asking Congress for a declaration of war. It's automatic. Just like Shabbat automatically is Saturday, Friday night. It's not like you have to go every Friday afternoon and ask a beis din, a court, may we declare Shabbat in a few hours when the sun goes down. You do go to court for permission in biblical times, in Beit HaMikdash times, to declare the new month. You can't the new month does not begin automatically. You need to bait in a court's declaration with testimony, witnesses, etc. But you don't ask a court to declare Shabbos, and you don't ask a court to declare a Milchemet Mitzvah. It's automatic. If you have the opportunity to wipe out the Chivi, Yavusi, Girgashi, you have to wipe them out. If you cannot wipe out Amalek, you have to wipe them out. And if Israel is attacked, there's no need for any permission to go and fight back. The king, and now we see why I've spent all this time on the power of the king. The king just declares war. Again, different from Franklin Roosevelt going to Congress, asking for a declaration of war, or George W. Bush asking for a declaration of war or whatever after 9/11. The king just declares war, and everybody has to go. And we've been learning plenty about the king's authority to enforce the decree. And he compels everybody to go to war. And you don't have draft dodgers and draft resistors. There's no resistors. He can have them executed on the spot without court approval. We've been learning about that. And there's no conscientious objections in and of itself. There's some variation where we've learned, and we'll go back to it in a week or two, about that general waiver for people who have just planted a vineyard in the first year of its planting, or just got married, or rather just getting engaged to get married. So there are those 2 or 3 waiver situations, but by and large, that's it. But there's no conscientious objection. They do have a thing where the Mashuach Milchama, there are 2 main Kohanim, the Kohen Gadol, the one who we've been learning about the last few weeks in Shul, Torah readings in Parshat Truma, and Parshat Tetzaveh, and we'll be learning Vayakel Pekudei. That's the religious Kohen leader who oversees the religious ritual service at the Beit HaMikdash, and there's the Mashuach Milchama. There's other primary Kohen who gets anointed to lead the people into battle as their spiritual guide, side by side with the king and the generals and everyone. And that Kohen makes a public announcement. Anybody who's weak-hearted and scared may pull out right now before we get started. So not for conscientious, none of this stuff about conscientious objection. I oppose war as a matter of principle. I'm a Quaker. I'm a whatever it is, Seventh-day Adventist or a J witness, whichever group it is that doesn't pledge allegiance and doesn't, none of this conscientious objection, I oppose war. But if a person says, I'm scared, I'm too scared to fight, they are given a waiver. Torah tells us that it does not want an army where frightened people are going to weaken the morale of the fighters. Look, everybody sane is a little bit scared, of course. They're shooting at you, God forbid. They're bombing at you. There's mines on the ground and tunnels underneath. But I'm talking about people that are like too scared to pull a trigger because they're just in terror. Other than that, everybody's got to go. Kofa Amlet Seit, you force him. Although Milchemet R'shut, but for the voluntary war, the expansionist imperialist war, Eino motzi ha'amba el al pi betin shel shivim v'yachad. It only can be declared if the Sanhedrin of 71 agrees to decree or to confirm the king's request for an expansionist imperialist war. Again, this is never, Rambam is 1,000 years ago, post-biblical, post-Mishnah, post-Talmud. We've never been in a position since 1948 that would be like that. And we have never sought an imperialistic expansionist war. The left will argue, what about 1967, the Six-Day War? Six-Day War is a classic example of, like the present war, where the enemy first strikes the first blow. Although people speak about it having been a preemptive attack, the preemptive part was that the Israeli Air Force took out the Egyptian and Syrian air forces on the ground before those planes got in the air. But the first military action, the first act of war, was when Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran. That's an act of war. When you bring in your ships and you create a blockade, that's an act of war of your enemy. And he announced he's going to war. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. You could look it up. And we've even went as a shul one year to a movie about it, a documentary. So in that war, once you're already fighting a defensive war, having been attacked, if land comes into your hands, we'll get to it. Al pi halakha, you can hold on to it. It becomes your land. But you're not supposed to start a war to gain more land, even though it's part of the promised lands, because the people living there, we don't know that they're descendants of the Girgashite, let's say. Okay. We talked about that he can do the Fifth Amendment takings, and you could take seas and all that. Okay. Mitzvot say lacharim shiva amamin. So we just said it's one of the 613 positive commandments in the Torah to eradicate utterly the 7 nations, as it says, and we just read it, hacharim tacharimim. I emphasize that it's a double verb. You shall utterly destroy them. And it actually gets to the point, again, Rambam is talking 1,000 years after the Roman exile, 1,000 years before now, around the year 1100. Someone who encounters a Canaanite, a Perizzite, a Hivite, a Yebusite, and does not kill him, his passive non-killing is a sin, is a passive sin. There are active sins. Someone eats non-kosher. Someone has a ham and cheese. I don't know, or ham and eggs, whatever they have with ham. So that's an act that's one form of a sin. And then there's a passive thing where you're supposed to do something and you don't do it. So if you don't do it and you don't have a good reason for not doing it, if you have a reason for not doing it, so that could depend. But if you, like, let's say you have to fast on on Yom Kippur, and a person doesn't fast if they don't have a medical reason, so it's a sin. If they're eating, it's also an active act. So they're violating on 2 levels. And then there are just a lot of things. You don't do a lulav and etrog. So what's the sin? The sin is that for the man who did not do a lulav and etrog on Sukkot, it's a passive sin. So if you don't kill one of those people, it's a sin. But Rambam adds, uchevar avad zichram, which is what I've been telling you, which you know anyway. The memory of them has already been obliterated. We don't know who they are. So that's a sin that no longer matters. It's something to study. It's interesting. But you're not going to meet there's no Yavusi out there, or Girgashi, or Achivi, or Kanani. They're just not there. The Chiti, the Amori, they're not there. So it no longer applies. And Amalek no longer applies. So the only kind of mitzvah war that exists and still applies is when an enemy starts a war with the Jews. That's the only kind. And it's also a positive commandment to wipe out the memory of Amalek. And of course, that's the old pink elephant in the room syndrome. When someone tells you don't think about that pink elephant in the room, so you're thinking about the pink elephant in the room. And don't think about the following, so you can't help but think about the following. So when you're told, don't remember Amalek, so in order to remember that you're not supposed to remember Amalek, you have to remember Amalek. What's Amalek? You're not supposed to remember Amalek. What's Amalek? Well, Amalek is, so now you're remembering him. It's tricky. And it's a paradox that only resolves itself in Messianic times. Now, it happens to be that Amalek no longer exists to the degree that we can't find them. We don't know who they are. And there's all this talk about how Sanhedrin, Rambam and others talk about, there's a Tosefta in the Talmud about how Sanhedrin from the Bible completely mixed up all the different nations, and we don't know who everybody is. And that goes, so we know, as we said earlier tonight, Bibi was talking figuratively to inspire the nation, that there are those like Adolf Hitler who exist exclusively to destroy us. And we must remember and never forget. And so we will remember. End of story. Shnemar timched zecher Amalek, as it says in the Torah. Wipe out that we read it. Umitzvat Aza, lizkor tamid ma'asav ha'ra'im v'arivato. And it is a mitzvah, we fulfilled it tonight, always to remember their evil and that they ambushed us from behind. Tonight we talked about how they ambushed us from behind and they're evil. So we fulfilled a mitzvah. Just my teaching it and you listening to it. All of us together fulfilled a mitzvah. And what about wiping them out? We didn't do it. We can't do it. There are certain mitzvahs you can't do. And whether that's good or bad, it just is. I can't offer a sacrifice. There's no Beit HaMikdash. A person who has a beautiful marriage never can fulfill the mitzvah of giving a get. That's one of the 613 mitzvot, to give a get. If you, Baruch Hashem, are married and have a beautiful marriage, you'll never give a get. So you'll never do that mitzvah. What if you're not blessed by God with children? Happens. So you can't fulfill V'shinantam Levanecha. You could figuratively fulfill it. You could teach other people. Peru or Avu, you're supposed to be fruitful and multiply. What if you can't have kids? There are mitzvahs you cannot accomplish in a lifetime. There are certain mitzvahs that don't apply to men. The woman going every month to the mikveh. So that mitzvah does not apply to men. Other mitzvahs don't apply to women. There are mitzvahs that don't apply to people who are not a Kohen. There are other mitzvahs that apply to everybody but a Kohen. So not everybody could do every mitzvah. God understands. And that's where Amalek comes in. But you should continue Kedei La'orer Evato. It is a mitzvah, even in the absence of Amalek, unable to eradicate them, to educate ourselves and each other and our people about what true evil is, and to hate evil. You should hate evil. You should not be consumed with hate. You should be consumed with love. But it is important, as part of being consumed with love, is to hate evil. And we see it nowadays. All these free Palestine people, they're so worried about, and meantime, they're beating up Jews, not that many, but too many, on college campuses. And they're anti-Semitic, and a lot of different things are going on in the streets. And Jews afraid in England. And the British House of Commons actually members of parliament this past week standing in the House of Parliament saying that they've got to pass a resolution or some of the members of their party are going to get beaten up by the constituents. So we should be filled with love, and part of love is hating evil. And it is taught as part of a tradition. How do you remember? But it also says, don't forget. Are they different? Isn't that the same thing? If you don't forget, you remember. If you remember, you don't forget. So the mitzvah to remember is with your mouth, like what I've been doing tonight. And lo tishkach balev. You shouldn't forget in your heart. You should always remember what Amalek did. She'asur lishkoach evato v'sinato. A Jew must never forget the hatred and evil of Amalek. It reminds us that the world is complex. Again, we should be overwhelmingly 99.99% overwhelmingly filled with love. Love of God, love of life, love of the people around us, thankful for everything. But the flower children who walk around oblivious to the idea that there actually are evil people in the world. Those who believe, you know what? Every person is good. Every person inside, every person is a little honest boy or girl yearning to breathe free. It's a little bit naive. It's very naive. And that's what the Milchemet Mitzvah really is about. We're wrapping up now, just a little bit more to finish this segment. Kol ha'aratzot shekovshin Yisrael b'melech al pi betin, every land that Israel conquers under a king, not a prime minister, but under a Beit HaMikdash monarchy kind of regime. And if it's going to be al pi beitin, so that means it's an optional war. Because if it were a mandatory war, you would not have needed a bet din. So, okay. We're not going to be fighting Amalek. We're not going to be fighting the seven nations. We are going to go to war against those that attack us. Any land we win in a defensive war is ours forever. And if we go into an offensive imperialistic war for which we need 71-man Sanhedrin to approve, then what's the status of that expanded land of Israel? You know, there are certain mitzvahs that apply only in the land of Israel. Shabbos applies everywhere. Kashrus applies everywhere. But to take a tithe, maser, or truma, that's only from produce of the land of Israel. It's not from the American farms. So when Israel conquers more land in an imperialistic war, an optional war approved by Beis Din, do the farms, vegetables, and fruit on those expanded lands now become, as part of Israel's sovereignty, do they now become obligated in Truma and Maser and other such things that apply particularly there? And what we're being told is that when you take land as part of the expansion, in those rare cases, and it like never happens, of course, all the lands that Israel conquers in wars led by a king and approved by the Sanhedrin are considered as conquered by the people at large. Thus, they have the same status as Eretz Yisrael. You notice how it's translated here? The translation is appropriate. Do you notice he could have written land of Israel? That's the translation of Eretz Yisrael. But he went out of his way to italicize Eretz Yisrael, that he's referring not to the land of Israel only geographically, but theologically. It now has the status of the land of Israel, which was conquered by Joshua. In other words, this land would have application to some of these laws. This applies if they were conquered after the conquest of Eretz Yisrael as described by the Torah. So first you have to win over all of Israel's halakhic borders, and only then can you do it. And that's the place we're going to let it go for now, unless there are any comments or questions. So the highlight takeaway for tonight is that we're currently in a watching Israel in a Milchemet Mitzvah. For that, they don't need a Beit Din, they don't need a Sanhedrin. When the enemy attacks, if this were 1943, 1941, before there even were a state of Israel, Hitler, for Jews to fight Hitler, if it could be coordinated and organized, which we know from history it couldn't be, but that would be a Milchemet Mitzvah, if there would be a way for Jews to take down the Nazis then. Anyone who attacks the Jews as Jews, so it's a Milchemet Mitzvah today. Number two, that expansion is allowed, but it never happens. You would need a Sanhedrin to approve it. Number three, if there is an expansion, then all land conquered under the name rubric of the national effort becomes subject to Truma Masir and other aspects of the holiness of land of Israel. And maybe most importantly of all for today, to distinguish between the theory of war and the theory of morality versus the greater context of the time and place, understanding that the culture of a time and place when there's a Beit HaMikdash and a sitting Sanhedrin creates an entirely different cultural milieu that leads to different Jewish practices. And the kinds of things that we all do Judaically would be kicked up several notches, not out of fear of punishment, but out of the practicality. If there were a Beit HaMikdash and a Kohen Gadol, and if there were a Sanhedrin and all of these things, it would be a very, very different world. We would be different. Our attitude to korbanot sacrifices would be different. Our attitude to so very much would be different. And in the same way, our attitudes towards war. We're blessed that both in Judaism and contemporary Christianity, both Protestantism and Catholicism, there's an understanding and the evolution of time. And the concern is that within the Arab Muslim communities, there are those who also believe that what it says in the Quran, it says, but today XYZ. So when you meet an Arab Muslim who tells you, no, we don't believe that, we don't do that, don't assume they're lying. Many truly believe that there are things in the Quran. Quran has a lot of contradictory text. And depending on how you interpret it and what you highlight, you could really find almost anything that you want to find in the Quran. However, unfortunately, between fatwas and other stuff, we know there are a lot of people, many of whom have access to serious weapons, who really take it all literally to this day. And that includes, for many of them, like Hamas, the idea that it's in their charter, there's no choice, but they're commanded to wipe out the Jewish people from the river to the sea. Palestine must be free. And that means you've got these different clashes. Thank you very much for being here. We'll continue with this, God willing, next week. As you see, we're past background now, and now we're getting into hard text. Be well. Laila Tov. Shabbat Shalom.